That was absolutely a wonderful introduction, but I did want to clear up one rumor, because you recognize the fact that we switched with Peter Lee, and many people have thought the reason I switched is to keep my picture up on the board for everybody, but that's really not true. So that's part of that. The nice part about being old is you can say what you want to say, and you're going to hear what I want to say about some things, because I'm frustrated that many things I talked about in 1990 are still topics of conversation, and things that I wrote in 1990, I could send them to a magazine to get published immediately because the problem still exists, and that's part of what I'm trying to make everybody be aware of. But since a lot of the people here, and we're going to make sure are new, I wanted to give just a little bit of history. I think the future depends sometimes on having some idea where the past. So I've talked about the biography of HL7, and it started out with a courtship of niche vendors that wanted to create a hospital information systems with best-of-breed components. And the competition at that time was an IEEE group called Medics, who wanted to build a more comprehensive model-based standard. The conception and birth was at Hospital University of Pennsylvania. There was arguments in the appearance as to whether we would have position-defined delimiters or XML tags. And recognizing the fact that the baud rate that we were using is somewhere around 110 to 300 baud, I actually calculated the cost of sending a single character, and we won the argument of using delimiters, and that's why version 2 has the delimiters. It simply was expensive. I actually must confess that I shudder a little bit at looking at the number of characters that we now send on current messages too. But the implementation was mostly in the hospital, and it was implemented by the people that defined the standard. The teenage years. Small membership. We fought for recognition. We were largely ignored. At the time, I hated it. It's nice to be ignored sometimes. You can do what you want to do and nobody gives you a hard time about it. We had a demonstration at HIMSS, and we began to attract vendor membership. The clever idea was have a balloon with HL7 on it, and it got to be the thing to do at HIMSS to put the balloon up, and you had to join HL7 to get your balloon. And so that was the way that we moved forward. CDC was one of the first government organizations that became a visible and active member of HL7. Most of the implementations were in homegrown systems. We really didn't have the commercial systems coming forward as universal as they are now. But the flexibility was provided through Z segments, which what everybody yells about. The format and the syntax was easy to understand. So I didn't mind going and talking about V2 because the people in the audience typically would understand what I was talking about. The adult and maturing years, as the sharing of data increased and electronic storage of data increased, so did V2. And you've heard people talk about what percentage of hospitals now have that. And V2 still probably will continue to exist for a period of time. V2's sibling, V3, reverted back to the model-driven approach. The Medics people now were in HL7 and pushing that model-driven approach. The problem was the complexity was too difficult not only to use, but to understand. And I hated to give a talk on V3 because I knew I could never say it in a way the audience would really understand what I was talking about. The CDA came along, and it was a templated approach of significant improvement, I think, on V3 messaging, but it was easy to understand, but it was inflexible. I think it didn't have the flexibility, and I think all of that was really part of that. But then along came FHIR. Now, I think the good news, and part of my message, is the fact that if FHIR had been earlier, I don't think it would have the impact. But the significant change in the early days of HL7 and now is the fact that the audience for HL7 is huge and is growing. And I think that's part of the reason. And if you look at the different groups that I've listed on the slide itself, you get some idea of what the number of groups, different kind of groups that's been involved. And I think we're going to see that grow. And then you're looking at some significant players here, Apple, Google, Microsoft, and others that are take-ups of the standard itself. So I think it's the right time the planets were aligned. And I think that's why we're seeing such a quick and rapid front. FHIR is more than a standard. So that's one of the things I really want to argue for in terms of the future. It now has become almost a philosophy. It's understanding that it's not just the standard and the technical aspect of moving the data, it's the idea that we need to move the data. And I'm using a classical picture of the blind men in describing the elephant. When I hear people talk about FHIR, I hear their vision of their understanding of FHIR is at a lot of different levels. And I think it really is a data model. I think it is defines a set of common data elements. It contains data. It's a data transport. It's a document and a template standard. And we have extensions, but we need to worry about the control of the extensions to keep it as a standard. Because if it's uncontrolled, you're going to have thousands. And so you're back to no standard again of what we were talking about. But I think FHIR is now influencing the future. It's opening up the world. And all of these, we now understand the value of sharing data. And we need seamless flow of data. And the recent HIMSS meeting, FHIR was the talk of the town. Almost many presentations, the conversation about FHIR, ONC, CMS, CDC, HHS, EHR, vendor community, and many others show the expanse of the impact of FHIR. So I like two quotes. The first one is by Albert Einstein. The future is not a gift, it's an achievement. And I think that's the challenge that I'm offering to you, is that it's not just talking about it, it's not just doing it academically. My joke is the fact that when you talk about an academician is defined as someone who sees something working for real and wonders if it works in theory. I think that's the kind of thing that we need to understand with HL7. It's got to be used. And so it's the achievement that we're talking about. This is one of my favorite recent books about it, From Gutenberg to Google. And if you think about the impact of the printing press, before that, we had no way of really communicating and spreading knowledge and information. With the printing press, all of a sudden, we now can, it influenced people learning to read. Just all the impact of that is what we really are talking about. And I think you can compare FHIR to that. And then now I'll talk on any topic. I just Google the topic and use Wiki to see what I'm going to say. So that's the kind of impact that I think FHIR is having a similar impact on what we were talking about. The world is changing at an exponential rate. Change creates new technology, new initiatives, and stakeholders that are beginning to recognize that the future requires the use of standards. And I think that's the popularity of FHIR. That's why 2/3 of the people here are here for the first time. You still are in a select set of people, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But I'm going to go through these slides rather quickly because I just want you to start thinking about them rather than making a lot of comments about what we're talking about. So I've listed a set of technology. And what I want you to do is to start thinking about how you're going to use this technology in the future. And the comment that I would make is if you are working on today's problems, you're out of date. You've got to work on tomorrow's problems to really begin to catch up with where you're going to go. The first picture that's the electronic health record we did in 1969, 1970, that's a 4K PDP-12 with 4K of main memory, and the max storage was 300,000 characters, and we did 3 EHR systems on that computer. I think we should make the coders of today work off of a 4K machine. You spend a lot of time with a single. And I just happened to pick an Apple Watch here because I'm wired as we talk to my electronic health record and my personal care provider at Duke. But there's more storage, more capability of that watch than I've had my entire career up to the fact of doing all of that too. And now this is illustrating the EKG. But what does that open? And there must be 25 or 30 more sensors that I can use to track me. So FHIR plays an important role, and we need to begin to deal with other forms of data than clinical data. And I'm hearing a little bit of conversation about that. Imaging is certainly part of that, but social data, economic, and all the other kind of data that we're talking about. What's new? What's different? New voices, patients, consumers, whatever we want to call them. I find it interesting that we find it reluctant to call everybody a patient. I'm hooked up to my doctor. Does that make me a patient? Well, I thought I was a patient when I was born, and I'm a patient now. I don't get insulted by that word, but we seem to do it. We look for consumers and citizens and everything else. Googling has introduced an awareness on the part of the patient of what's going on, what their disease means, what the possibilities of treatment are. So we've got a whole bunch of people, and that's changing how healthcare is delivered, and we'll continue to do that. We're shifting care outside of the traditional settings. It's easier to get treated at home than it is to fight the traffic, to get to Duke, to pay a price of parking that's almost the same as the price of the encounter, and then walking in at 7 o'clock in the morning and see that the doctor's running 45 minutes late. Those are the kinds of things that are frustrating, and it's much better if we can change that setting outside the institutions. So I think brick and mortar are going to be a thing of the past. I have a favorite slide of Duke Hospital that says a for sale sign in front of it, and I'm showing that to the administrators at Duke. That's why I'm here, not at Duke right now. But patients want to push their data back into the EHR. So it's a bidirectional flow, because whatever is happening to me will happen to me while I'm standing on this stage talking to you after having a lot of fun last night. But that's the kind of thing I need to have. Smart systems that understand when I need the attention of a professional to help me take that next step of what we were talking about. So policy is changing. And again, these are not constraints. I've heard some conversation here, you can't do that because it's the regulations, you can't do that because of policy. And part of our job is not just the technology of creating standards, it really is of changing all the things that are necessary to be changed to be able to do what we want to do. New types of data. Clinical data, I think, is 10% of what determines your health index is the traditional clinical data. And I said, I've worked my whole career on clinical data. Now I've got to worry about all the other kinds of data, behavioral, social, economic. There are factors that really have a direct involvement. The FHIR has to deal with these new elements. So we need to begin to worry about social determinants of health. We need to worry about genomics. They need to worry about it. We're beginning to do that. But how we put that into the patient care setting is what the challenge is for what we're talking about. Big data. What's big data? Anything I say is big data. I define it. It may be for a single patient. It may be for all the patients in the world. I really have dreams of creating a single database with 7.8 billion people in that database. And I think that's doable within a year or two. Not everything about everything, but trying to establish the level of connectivity. To do that, who do I have to talk to? Lots of people, lots of governments, lots of other things we're talking about. So FHIR aggregates data, and I think that's a critical part of what we're talking about. There are issues of governance, but you know, in 2017, we created 44 zettabytes. You know, the biggest thing that time has given to me is told me all these adjectives to put in front of bytes. And when I first started, we talked about bytes, and then I went to kilobytes, and I went to megabytes, and I was in heaven. I mean, to finally get off with 330,000 K and go to 2.1 megabytes, it solved all of my problems at that time. So decision making, I think this is significant. The amount of data and the kinds of data, and you've heard the conversation that humans are capable of only dealing with 5 to 7 facts in making a decision. Now we're throwing thousands of facts as part of that decision making process. And the consequence of that is it's going to be more than the human can assimilate. And so I think we're going to see decisions made directly by computers. And if we're better for it, who cares? Why do we have to say it has to be humans? Computers can do it, they will do it. A bunch of national initiatives. I'm not going to go into detail because the speakers have talked about that. Requirements for data liquidity and direct data sharing. So just a couple of quick slides. There's some problems to solve. Patient matching, universal IDs. There's a bill introduced today, I guess by Foster Kelly, that's going to Congress now that will give us a universal identifier if it goes through Congress on that too. Common language. Why do we want to map from one language to the other? Crazy, a lot of time. So there are other problems to solve. The standards are doing it. These are some of the activities at Duke. I don't have time to really talk about those, but again, there's a great deal of activity. Ricky Bloomfield, you see some of his contributions at Duke in 2015 that we're doing before some of this stuff really started, but it's continuing in the things that we're going about. Last comment that I will make is the fact that I think there are three sets of people that deal with standards. The first are the standards developers. Many of you here are part of the standards development community. The second set are the implementers. That's most of what is here. But the big group of people that's most important to us is the users. They don't understand what we're doing. They're heading in that direction, and I think that's where we want to go. So let me stop with that, and thank you very much for the time.